Slides, right? So we're here to talk to you about sorry, that sounds a little scratchy there, but anyway, here the international patient summary about what's new and what's fun. And I guess I get to tell you mostly about the what's new part, and James gets to tell you about the what's fun part. So that ought to be good. Let's see. Sorry. Yeah. There we go.
We're on the Zoom.
All right. Very good. All right. Let's see if we can look through the slides. So a little bit of introductions to start. Myself, I'm Rob Hausam. I am an MD, FHIR core team member and primary editor of the IPS FHIR IG, and also the CDA team member and primary editor. HL7 editor of the International Patient Summary IPS CDA IG, and I'm an independent consultant and do FHIR IG and terminology. International Patient Summary IPS.
Like Rob, I've been working with FHIR core team for a good long time now, and I've been leading the HAPI project, roughly the start of it.
All right. So my part, I'm going to subtitle a bit, IPS, what it is, what's new, what's coming. My part, I'm going to subtitle that part, and James will take over forward to talking more about as we said. So, all right. So let's talk a little bit about what the IPS is. It's a standardized set of basic clinical data. It's intended to include most of the important health and care-related facts. It's a summarized version of a patient's clinical data. It's intended to provide health professionals, with the essential information that they need, to provide care for a patient. And we consider it to be it's a minimal and a non-exhaustive set of the basic clinical data for the patient. We have a few principles that we follow regarding the content, including that it's intended to be specialty agnostic. It's not tied to any one particular kind of provider or provision or care provision. It's independent of the specific conditions. It should be usable across pretty much any type of clinical condition that a patient might have. And it's intended also to be readily usable by, hopefully by all clinicians for unscheduled care, and particularly cross-border care. That's the original prototype use case for the IPS. We have, we basically allow for other use cases as well, but that's, again, that's sort of that's where we started. We were thinking of international borders, but when we talk about cross-border, we don't mean necessarily only national borders. That might be the most prominent thing you would think of, but it can be, there's borders lots of places in the health system. There may be borders between, the health system that you're part of and the one across the street, in your city or whatever, or it could be different states or provinces or jurisdictions within a country or various other things. But any kind of border which tends to prevent the sharing of data is the idea of what we're trying to provide a means to share that data across those borders. And so in order to do this, we have, we've basically been working as a cross standard development organization, cross SDO initiative. And we've got a number of SDOs involved in this, and you'll see them listed here. ISO towards the top, and SEN from Europe. It's been very prominent here, and particularly with the European cross-border exchange work that SEN has been involved in. HL7 International, IHE International, and SNOMED. Those are the main ones that we work with. And this nice little pictorial here kind of shows how this all fits together. You've got basically the building blocks, the HL7 FHIR and CDA IGs, and the terminology with SNOMED, sort of the mortar, and anyway, all the other things fit together. It's a nice pictorial that was put together for this. I think it kind of illustrates what we're trying to do pretty well. And you see some links at the bottom if you want to go. And I think I have references to those a little bit farther on. If you want to go to get some more information about all this. Okay. So this slide talks about our IPS landscape and kind of shows again how these things maybe fit together in a little more detailed way. So we basically have, let's see if I can point these out here. We have the the CDA IG from HL7 and the FHIR IG, kind of twin standards that we've been working mostly on the FHIR IG for the last little while, but we do have the CDA IG published as well. And both of those reference the ISO 27269 standard. And the 27269 originally came from the SEN standards, and then they were moved into ISO. And 27269, which we kind of all know it by heart, I think, but I don't remember the number, but it's basically what we consider to be the IPS data set. It kind of sets the boundaries for what content we expect to have in the IPS. And so then we basically flesh that out with the implementations, like I said, the IGs, and SNOMED comes in here with the IPS reference set and also the IPS terminology that they're providing for use with IPS standards. And then down here towards the bottom of the diagram, we have the IHE IPS profile, which basically doesn't change the IPS. I don't know if I have a slide in here or not, but basically we have the idea. We basically have one IPS standard, and IHE and HL7 work together on this, but IHE can basically provide some additional profiling, and they do a lot of their excellent work with conformance testing and all of that. So they add additional value to the whole picture. So that's how that all fits together. And this slide describes a bit of the IPS data set. I mentioned that basically comes from the ISO 27269 standard is where that's codified. And you can see that we have a number of clinical domains. If you look here, starting medications, allergies, intolerance, problems, and immunizations, results, procedures. And we have some other sections that aren't listed on that diagram, which you may talk about, and you can see some of those down here. But the idea is that we have a set of these clinical domains, and we can use them together in an IPS document, but they also can be potentially used individually, as well as reusable library of data blocks. So we're trying to basically standardize as much as possible and make the IPS profiles as usable as possible across a wide variety of use cases. Yeah, sure.
Oh. Did we not share? Whoops. Of course. Oh yeah, share screen was not on.
All right. Little technical details here. There we go. Is that better? All right. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There we go. All right. So sorry for the folks remotely who didn't see those first slides, but hopefully we'll pick those up. This slide is about the IPS data model, as it says, and so just the main key points here is that, again, these kind of things, these all work together. We've got the various clinical domains, and the data is from the EHRs. As far as the IPS, we can have the document format. That's, again, kind of the prototype that we have conceived of. We basically pull all this together in a document and in a FHIR bundle, and we can send that around and get it to the place it needs to be. But we also have the library that I mentioned with the data blocks that potentially may have individual uses, like we've looked at immunizations and sort of a analog to the WHO yellow card. We've experimented with using the IPS profiles for exchanging that more limited set of data, things like that. Could be any number of things. And so we basically have the notion, again, of a summary of the relevant clinical data for a patient. Yep. All right, and this slide describes a little more fully the content that's available that we've profiled so far in the IPS. There's over here on the left side, there's kind of header type information, the subject, the author, tester, custodian, things like that, similar to what you'd find in CDA. And then the clinical ones, we have required sections of medications, allergies and intolerances, and problem list. And basically, what we're saying with that is we want, we expect in any IPS to have a statement of something about those. And that's true even if you don't have any, as if you're not taking any regular medications or you don't have any allergies or intolerances, we require a statement, to that, about that. Not just to leave it unknown. So those are the required sections, and just those three right now. And we also have a set of recommended sections, which includes the immunizations and, procedure history, use of medical devices and diagnostic results, and then a number of other optional sections. And we're looking at, as we look at revisions, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, we're looking at potentially new sections that may be added, that some people are requesting and all that. See how we're doing on time. All right, so we have a place you can go to get some further information on this. If you want a broader introduction and more details, we have we've set up the IPS website at internationalpatientsummary.net. It's a great place to go to get lots of information on this. So definitely want to refer you to that. We try to keep that up to date and relevant, and includes things like some of the presentations and all of that, as well as more detail on the standards. So make sure you take a look at that if you want to get some more details. All right. So the next slides will go into a few more things. I wanted to say some things about how IPS works with SNOMED CT for the terminology. Basically, SNOMED is, we consider to be our fundamental, our most primary terminology that we tend to recommend where we can, and as much as possible in the IPS. It's certainly not the only one that's allowed or that is recommended in certain areas, but it's sort of the fundamental go-to place for the clinical terminology. And so SNOMED has provided an IPS reference set, which includes a set of freely available SNOMED CT terms that they've made available for the use for HL7 for use in the IPS. And it's a great place to start, and it's usable. And the whole idea of it's basically what we call a free set, and it's available for use in any jurisdiction anywhere around the world, whether you're a SNOMED member or affiliate or not. And so that's a great a great resource that they've made available to us. And along with that, SNOMED publishes what they call the Global Patient Set, the GPS, and it includes the IPS free set as well as some additional ones from other organizations, and basically bundled in one package. But the latest thing that SNOMED has offered for use in IPS is the IPS terminology, which is a step beyond all of this and basically takes the content of the IPS free set and expands on that and makes available a full sub-ontology of SNOMED CT based around that. So we can do things with that we weren't able to do before. We can actually, I don't know if you were there for Peter Williams' talk yesterday about SNOMED. It talks about ECL, expression constraint language, and we can now use ECL for doing value set definitions, and we can in IPS create one value set definition that will work if you have full SNOMED content, like in a SNOMED member country, or you can work with the IPS terminology and still get the basically a terminology server that's aware of ECL would be able to use that and be able to expand and get the right set of content with a single definition. So that's part of the updates, and I have another slide on that here in a bit, but we're expecting to incorporate that in our next release. Okay. So the IPS basically is an extensible reference data model. As far as new data requirements, we want IPS to be able to cover all ages, not just only adults or all that. We're looking at, we've got some implicit workflows, and we're trying to work on doing further documentation to make those explicit. And we're considering adding, I said, some additional material like on alerts and risks, the patient story, family history, and things like that. Looking at new workflows and new cases, and including rare diseases and chronic conditions. We've had requests for some of these things. And we're also looking at, basically constraints and how to safeguard users of IPS, and, looking at aspects of reducing clinical burden and promoting trust and being able to assess relevance and, provenance kinds of things, and working further on usability and aspects to make this actually a practical thing for people to implement and use. All right. So getting back to the theme of cross SDO, around promotion of IPS adoption, we've got a couple of things going on with that. We've got the IPS within HL7. We have the IPS project group. We basically we're publishing the IPS standards, including the latest update to the FHIR IPS IG, which we published in November 2022. We also have a cross SDO group that's been working to coordinate all this, but amongst those 5 SDOs that I mentioned and potentially others. And we meet twice a week on that, and we're working on extending that to basically provide governance and process around maintenance of comments that we receive on the IPS from various sources, and trying to get those to the right place, the right SDO to address those. Some things may be addressed at the top level of the data set, in ISO, and others may need to be addressed in the IGs themselves or in the terminology or whatever. And we're putting together a process to make that all fit together. And John Demore will be talking a little bit about the GDHP, the Global Health, Global Digital Health Partnership, and how that fits in. So I won't say too much about that, but that's an important partner with what we're doing in IPS. And let's see what else. We do have in ISO, particularly also, we have a new effort to do a revision of the data set, because it's been a little while since we started that, and we've had new requests, and so we're trying to be responsive and continue to update to meet everyone's needs. And so we're doing work on that. So let's see what else we got. So some things. This slide just kind of tries to diagram a little bit about how do we work together on the IPS, and you can see some things in the pictorials here. We've got the base standards and use case standard sets, and various aspects here, and we've got the various groups involved. At the ISO doing the structure and content, and IHE focusing on workflow, and FHIR we have documents and APIs and all that, and so we've got a lot of moving parts here. And but what we do is we basically work together in close collaboration with the real world projects. And again, this it's kind of a busy slide, but you can see all the pieces and parts that kind of work together on this. And so GDHP, I just mentioned, and My Health EU is also involved in this. And we've got, we try to talk with other folks that have relevant things, Gravitate and Vulcan and all of that. So lots of pieces that we're trying to, make work together. And I think that as far as what we've learned about that so far, we've actually we've had quite a bit of success with this. The cross SDO collaborations seem to have worked pretty well. When we have a focused need like this, we've been able to achieve quite a bit of progress. We found that each SDO is bringing their unique expertise, their tooling, and their processes together, and we can all work together with that. We have a suite of artifacts. They work together, and ultimately, hopefully, to help the end user. We have definitely learned that we need to pay attention to growth and maintenance. Those are key steps. And that, if we leverage international collaborations, we can certainly promote adoption and implementation. And we work with the Joint Initiative Council and the GDHP, as I mentioned, and also the Global Consortium for E-Health Interoperability and others to try to do all this. Let's see, I think it's getting close. So a little bit more about just quickly about the GDHP and IPS. Again, John will talk some more about this here shortly, but a little later today. But there's 33 nations and territories. I think that's the right number. And the WHO that are involved, and so they've begun working with us, and as part of the interoperability work stream, and they're the goals of advancing IPS piloting and adoption, considering how IPS relates to policy and all that, and they provide a venue for nations to learn and connect and discuss about the activities, and they host and support connectathons. So along with the smaller mini connectathons, along with the HL7 ones that we do, and you see the list of the countries involved. It's a pretty good set there. So GDHP is an important partner. And along with that, we've also had some involvement with the G7 nations. And back in 2021, just not too long ago, the G7 moved to make support of IPS a policy priority. And they released a roadmap, and basically the G7 is has provided additional impetus for making this something that really hopefully will be helpful around the globe. And the UK, when they were basically had the presidency, or whatever you call it, as far as the G7, they provided a prototype demonstration about this, and you might find it very interesting. We're not going to have time to show it this morning, but if there's a link there, and I think it's a very interesting presentation of how we might be able to use the IPS with a patient-mediated data exchange, which is the primary way we're expecting it to be widely used. So you might want to take a look at that. It's a very interesting presentation. All right. And I wanted to say a little bit about kind of where we're going with IPS as far as particularly within HL7. We have some plans for further IPS ballot and publications. Right now, we're expecting to go back to HL7 ballot with a STU 2.0 version, possibly this September, but it may more likely be January 2024 before we do that. But that will allow us to do the full incorporation of the SNOMED IPS terminology and incorporate more of our implementation feedback. And we may also look at the FHIR shorthand for use. We're not using that right now. But and we also need to be thinking about what the state is and what the future plans are for the CDA. And essentially, we'd like to we basically said as much as possible we'll keep those aligned, but we need we kind of need folks to step up and want to put some effort into maintaining the CDA version before we'll be able to really do that. All right. And I wanted to say something about the IPS reference implementation or implementations. We're working to make available so you can see an example of how you could create IPS documents, and that's what James is going to be talking to us about here in just a bit. And there's a sample IPS server at ips.health, and there's a link to that. And the last slide I think I have is a little bit about ways to get involved in this process. We have our weekly HL7 calls. You see the link there. We have every other week the bi-weekly cross-SDO calls. Also, very interesting, and you're welcome to join if you're interested. And as always, and particularly in FHIR, you can talk to us on Zulip on the IPS stream, and we'd welcome any contributions and questions and all of that. So I think that's the end of my part.
All right, cool.
All right, so I'll hand it over to James.
Love it. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about generating IPS documents. I'll start by saying, the IPS spec itself, it is a lovely implementation guide. I had nothing to do with its creation, so it's not weird me saying that. If you haven't had a chance to check out the FHIR IG for IPS, I would highly recommend looking at it. The thing that I love about it, and sort of gravitated me to it early on, not even early on, like in the last year or so, I just sort of see it as this neat little microcosm of FHIR itself. It's a really nice specification that's sort of well specified. It's well enough specified that it seems implementable, but it's not so over specified that it would be really hard to extend to new use cases. It's just, it seems like a really easy to implement kind of thing. And I think it's at the same spot that perhaps FHIR was at way back when it was in its early DSTU1 days. And of course, the thing that really helped FHIR, take off in its early days, partly was just being a good specification. And of course, check, we've got that with IPS. The other thing that really helped FHIR take off was just the availability of good, high quality tooling to sort of work with the standard itself. So in that spirit, we've been trying to develop a tool chain that will allow you to develop your own applications, your own sort of systems for creating IPS documents using data that's stored already in FHIR repositories. So we sort of see, if there's easy to use tooling to do that, then the barrier goes down and hopefully more people will start adopting the standard. And that's what I want to talk about this morning, is a little bit about that. Obviously, the idea here is increasingly people have FHIR first repositories where they've got, great big mountains of data sitting in FHIR repositories. Things like jurisdictional repositories, longitudinal health records, shared health records, systems like that are a great example for that. Where I'm from, Canada, our model for interoperability largely centers around jurisdictional repositories. Each province will have a set of repositories that store shared health data. Things like EMRs and EHRs is another great example. Increasingly people are building those systems with either FHIR completely native or often at least with FHIR interfaces. So they've got some FHIR first capabilities. And that just seems like a really great spot to start mining for pulling IPS data out and potentially generating these documents. I'm sure you can't read that, but I love this chart. This comes from Canada, where I'm from, and it's sort of it's a comparison of the various sections that various provinces where I'm from intend to put into their IPS implementations. And as I realize it's unreadable, but you can sort of see that everybody's a little bit different and everyone's got flavors. And this is I highlight this just to sort of highlight the challenge in developing software to create these things. It's really easy to do it in sort of a one-off, I know my rules, I'm going to write software that does it. But what we wanted to do was come up with an API that would sort of allow anyone with whatever the rules were, like if you've customized, if you've added new sections, if your data is, maybe codified with different code systems than what everyone's expecting, like whatever is unique about your situation, we were trying to develop an API that would allow you to still generate IPS documents out of that. So the idea here is what we have released within the last release of the HAPI FHIR library is an implementation of what IPS calls the $summary operation. And $summary, it's a really simple operation. You effectively just give it the identity of a patient and say, you go off, generate me a document and give me that document back. There's a couple of other parameters that are in there, but really the only important one here that's worth talking about is just the identity of the patient. And from there, it's entirely left up to the server. What rules are you going to follow? How are you going to do it? So the idea here is we're going to assume you've got a HAPI FHIR server, you've got a bunch of relevant patient data in the system. I've got examples here, things like labs and meds and problems and all that, your encounters, all your resources. The system should be able to automatically extract out the relevant resources, package them up into a document, put together a narrative, because that's an important part of the IPS world, and ultimately turn that into a document. And the $summary, the return from that is such a document. So how does this whole thing work? We've developed an API sitting in the middle of HAPI that does this. Its core components, we've got a composition generator, and that sort of generates, if you're not familiar with FHIR documents, the composition is you can think of it as the table of contents for the document. It packages up the resources that go in there. It's got a narrative generator that generates the HTML representation of that document. And ultimately, this thing we call the document generator that bundles that all together and sort of spits out a document back to the user. So going through, the idea with this thing is each of these components is supposed to be customizable. And there's three endpoints, like there's three sort of components that a programmer would work with, again, in their own system, working with the library to do this. The first is the section registry. And the way that works is it's all code, and this is the only little bit of code I'm going to show you today, but this is just an example of creating a section within the document. This is one of the built-in, sort of the default sections, but the whole idea with the registry is if you've got custom sections for your implementation, you can add to the section registry. If you're constraining out one of these sections, you can actually remove them from the registry. You could even customize them if you've got your own rules for, what resources go in a section or whatever the thing is. All of that is doable. So the section registry is thing number one. Thing number two is the generation strategy. So this is the bit that describes what resources are we actually going to pull into the repository. You can sort of imagine, like if I've got a longitudinal health record and I want to generate, for example, a vital signs section. I might have the last 10 years of blood pressure measurements, and clearly in a summary, most people I think would agree, you probably don't want a 10-year history of blood pressure measurements. So the way that thing works is effectively it allows you to first specify a search And for the, for vital signs, for instance, you might say the search is going to be look for any observations with a category code of vital signs. And then we've got a filter, and you can sort of customize the filter. And, an example filter criteria might be, I'm only going to keep the most recent single one observation for each code. And all of this is customizable. I mean, the idea is very much that we've provided some default rules, but you as an implementer would work with those rules, decide, do they make any sense at all? And if they do, great. But if they don't, you could replace them, you could customize them, you could tweak them, whatever makes sense for you. The final bit, and this is kind of critical, and it's one of the most interesting things to me about IPS, is in IPS, you've got this real solid expectation that is sort of codified in the IG, that narratives are sort of a mandatory part of this. In FHIR in general, of course, narratives are always recommended. But I think as an application developer, you don't often sort of make an assumption that there's going to be one there. IPS does not allow for that assumption to exist. You've got to provide a narrative. So what we've done there is piggyback on top of HAPI FHIR's narrative generation framework, and sort of provided a bunch of default templates. I think maybe I do have one more bit of code. I realize that's a little bit of it's ugly code, of course, but this is what's called the time leaf templates, and these are used to generate narratives based on the various resources you might include. Once again, we've provided a default set, so these are all provided in with the library, but they too are entirely intended that you could take them and replace them, you could customize them, you could tweak them, you could do whatever you wanted with them. So that would of course be another nice bit of tooling. In the end, I guess this is probably the most important point about this is we have put this out. It's now been out for, I guess, one release cycle within HAPI. We're really looking for feedback. I mean, this is just the beginning. We're back in the same days that HAPI was in with the DSTU1 release, where people said, we like this about the library. We find these 8 other things awful and don't like the way they work. I'm kind of hoping we'll start getting that feedback about this library as well, because, even the API for generation, it seems like a good start, but I have to assume as people start trying to use it for real, we will see some, we'll find some things that aren't perhaps done as optimally as they could. So we're really looking for feedback. And of course, it's open source, so anyone is welcome to go and start playing with it. We do have it deployed up as well on our public HAPI FHIR server. So you can actually execute $summary against any patient that's up in that repository. I've got a screenshot of what you'll get back, which does show you the generated narrative, and you'll see all of the document as well. Last thing I'll say, we got lots of docs online, sitting online. We've got, this is a link to the HAPI documentation. There's also a link to the source code. So if you want to go through and see how does the section registry work, or what do our narrative templates look like, or any of that stuff, that's all up in there as well. A tiny bit on the roadmap for where we want to go with HAPI. Certainly, one thing I think is really interesting is the notion, today it's really tightly coupled with our JPA server, which is sort of the repository model with HAPI FHIR. But I mean, I think it would be really interesting to think about how we might decouple that. Like, could we run the IPS generator on a plain server? Could it be done on a device, for example? Like, could it be done on Android? Possibly. I think it would be really neat to think about how we could break that apart. The other bit that I think would be really neat is to think about adding sort of first order native support for smart health links within the HAPI library, just to sort of allow sharing of these documents a little bit better. If you're not familiar with smart health links and how they add to the picture, I'll give a little shout out for John's talk, which is going to be later today. You're going to see a whole bunch. I would totally recommend going if you're interested in IPS. You'll learn a bunch more about how smart health links sort of plays in that ecosystem. And I think when you see it all in action, I mean, it excites me. I think it's a neat view of how this stuff can work. So there we go. I think we hit the bell exactly. We're on time. We have some time for questions if anyone's got any.
Not sure who was first, but maybe.
Thanks, Rob and James. Rob, I have a question for you. One of the things in the header of the IPS is the custodian. Now, a patient might have a general position. Okay. I'll repeat it from the start. One of the things in the IPS header is the custodian. Now, a patient might have a general physician, might go to 2 hospitals. The patient is pregnant, other care professionals might be involved too. And there's not necessarily a single care professional who's taking care of maintaining a single IPS. So how do you see that? Do you suppose that could be some care practitioner maintaining a single IPS for a patient, or would a typical patient have 4 different IPSs?
Yeah, those are good questions, and I think we are still kind of, at least I would say, working towards getting, maybe more definitive answers for them. I don't think there is a single right answer to that question right now. I think that I guess partly, at least from my perspective, and others could possibly chime in on their thoughts, but I think that the first assumption, thing is to get an IPS out there, and we assume that there's going to be a clinician involved in that who would be who could be considered to be the custodian. I actually have to admit, I don't remember I don't believe we have that to be a required element, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, I think that the idea when we start getting into multiple providers and multiple IPSs and trying to basically update and combine and merge and all those kinds of things, we've got a lot of details to work out. We've left in the spec, we've left all of that pretty open so that we didn't lock ourselves down, too quickly, and we can gain from our implementation experience and all that and figure out what are going to be the best paths forward. So I think that's my answer right now. We're kind of, we're aware of that issue, we're thinking about it, and we'll try to come up with some, reasonable strategies that we could potentially recommend to people. Yeah. I think David had a question too. Maybe you want to go ahead. Sorry. Yeah. I think I saw his hand second. Yeah.
So as a patient, I want to carry my summary around with me. Is there a way for me to do that today? Other than I can use the IPS viewer and print it, but
well, I think that had some conversations with folks about ways that we might do that, including some of the Google folks yesterday, and looking at the Android SDK, and just sort of exploratory discussions. But we expect that the mobile device is going to be a primary way for doing this. That's what I'd like to be able to do on my device, and all that. So I think the answer is not quite yet, but that's where we expect to be getting to.
So how do I connect with whoever wants to work on that?
Well, join us on the calls or in Zulip and ask some questions, or pose some, yeah. Absolutely.
And I know there's a session later today on patient-mediated IPS exchange. That's the one you were talking about?
That's John, yep. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll just say, it seems to me the natural thing to do is to head toward having everybody's IPS attached to their passport app.
Yeah. Right. So I think we got some very interesting things to explore there, Dave. Yeah. So,
yeah. I wanted to follow up on both of your comments about custodianship in sort of different ways. My name's Bill Lober. I work at University of Washington, and I work for the Washington State Department of Health, so for our local government unit. And we've been exploring this idea of the state government being a custodian for a patient-mediated IPS. And one of the challenges in trying to do that is, when you framed your question earlier, you framed it in terms of which clinician would be the custodian. And Dave framed his question in terms of how can the patient be the custodian. We've been trying to look at government being a custodian, and the challenge that we're trying to work through is that there would be different types of provenance for different types of information in the IPS. So one type of information might be information for which the state feels like we're authoritative, like information from our immunization registry. Another type of information might be information for which the patient is authoritative, like an advance directive. That's really a statement by the patient. Another type of information might be information that the patient chooses to import from the electronic health record of their healthcare provider. So I think that your question about who is the custodian, both of your questions, is really good. And trying to work through that challenge for us may turn out to be whether we can serve as a custodian, whether state government can serve as a custodian of information that it doesn't necessarily originate. So It's good. I'm glad you raised that. Who could?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. So maybe that's,
Right.
maybe that's why we're here then to meet. Who can I pass the mic to?
Ooh.
Okay. So Maximilian asks, what if the instance conforming to a custom profile, which should be packaged up for the IPS document, is incompatible to the IPS profiles?
Huh.
Yeah, I have to think about that for a second. I mean, I guess partly, I'm not sure really what the thrust of this question is intended to be. Maybe we can get some clarification on it, but
It might be about just
but-
generation. Like maybe the
Yeah.
idea is if you've got a repository where data's come from everywhere and that data, you know, is valid against some profile, but not the IPS profiles. What do we do there? I mean, I
Yeah.
would guess that's the question.
yeah, I was going to say it has to do with validation basically. And yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, the idea is we can, we'll try to make our profiles as open as possible and all that. And so we would, I don't know if we would necessarily expect to run into a lot of issues like this, but it's something, yeah, each system, I guess, will have to determine how it handles validation and what the expected result is if you fail validation or whatever. But so there's some things to work through there. Yeah. And maybe John, yeah. What do you? Mhm.
Oh, 1 minute.
Just to comment on that question of what happens when you have a bunch of resources you want to package in an IPS, but those aren't conformant to all the profiles in the IPS for it. I think that, Rob, what you were getting towards is we've left a lot of openness and also ability to add information in IPS that isn't really, specified there, which is it's not a closed list
Yeah.
of sections you can have. You can have other sections that you want to include for it. The key thing is that if the composition is conformant to the IPS, and that's a kind of an expectation, that composition kind of that links everything together. And as James talked about, has the narrative, you're going to have some usability of that data.
Yeah.
So you're going to be able to use some of that information downstream for it. Whether all of the resources are going to be conformant, probably not in the near term from my perspective for it, because we're all getting started from different points. We all, particularly in an international context, we all have different bases or cores at a national level for IG specifications. So I think that Max has got a good question because there's going to be a lot of variability in the individual resources. But if we've got some commonality at the composition, we will have some interoperability. I don't want to say full, but
That's a good point.
Thank you. All right, I think we've hit time. Should we finish it out? Or take more questions? Okay, we are done. So thank you so much to our speakers, Rob, James. This was wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for being here.
Nice.
that's exactly how happy we're.